What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to Comic Breakdown. If you guys are new to the channel, make sure that you like and sub this channel. This is going to be our first live video, so this is going to be super awesome. I'm really excited. We're going to be doing an interview with Trevor, who is the comic and editor of Pocket Watch Press.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Writer. Well, regarding Pocket Watch Press, yeah. Publisher, editor, president.
Gotcha. And then he's also been writing the comic that is Area 51, the Helix Project.
Oh, yeah. Man.
And the Kickstarter for issue number 6, the final issue, will be dropping today. So make sure you guys check that out in the comments. Trevor, why don't you go ahead, introduce yourself, and let us know what we're going to get into today.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, brother. It is a pleasure to be here. My name is Trevor Fernandes-Lenkiewicz. Say that 10 times fast. I'm the writer, editor, and creator of Area 51, the Helix Project. It's a sci-fi thriller about a half extraterrestrial child of two worlds who's forced to excavate the trauma of his past when a mysterious figure puts his father's murder into question. And this sends him sort of spiraling into the jaw of this massive Cold War genetics conspiracy, and ultimately forces him to face a twisted ghost from his past that challenges everything he knows about himself and what it means to be human. So super personal story. And what's cool is my academic background in college was in molecular and cellular biology. So all the sci-fi stems from real hard science.
Yeah, he's definitely got some big words in there. some of those medical terminology I had to look up just because I had no idea what they were talking about. I actually have to go back and look this stuff up. All right, so this is the last issue. So this is issue number 6.
Man.
With it being the last issue, how does it feel?
Oh, dude, it's crazy. It is weird. I started this thing and it was just like in the middle of a pandemic. And I don't know. I was just like, I want to do this. I want to try my hand. And over the course of these 6 issues, man, I feel like I've grown so much. I feel like my collaborators have grown so much. And now, walking out of this book, I just have like a million ideas, and hopefully it blossoms into a fruitful career.
Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about that a minute ago off air, how it's been about 2.5 years, coming up on 3 years maybe, because we started roughly around the same time. Me with my comic book YouTube channel, and then you have your comic book ongoing, and we've been watching these grow side by side for quite a while, and it's been a lot of fun because you're essentially the only person that I usually interview. I don't usually do this too often.
Let's go.
But
yeah, man.
And I think that's mainly because, you were there helping me. You have your comic book channel, though you're not so active on it. You were helping me out. So I figured, a way to pay you back for that was definitely having you on here throughout this. And then it just became one of my favorite indie comics that's out there.
Thanks,
it's just those deep indie comics that Kickstarter ones just don't get enough attention. It's really hard to get them really. Keanu Reeves, he was able to put out Berserker, but that, his name and everything attached to it was so easy to make money on Kickstarter versus someone like you that's literally self-promoting, and you just got back from New Orleans doing a Comic-Con there, and then you're doing a signing in Connecticut here in a couple weeks. Like, you're keeping yourself busy all the time, and not enough praise gets to you guys because there's a lot of you guys out there.
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that. It's a labor of love, and at the end of the day, people like me, we make our career off of the people that just want to talk about it and tell other people that they've enjoyed it. Folks like you, man, and so, and very literally, without you and people like you who have really taken to the story that we're trying to tell, I wouldn't be in the position that I'm in, and that I am grateful beyond words for someone who writes for half of his living. So
yeah. All right. So question number 2, I'm going to have, what have you done to improve your writing since the very first issue?
Well, I think a lot of it is constant reflection. I've even, you alluded to my time like doing comic book YouTube reviews and such, and I've always been sort of the analytical type. And that very much extends to my own work, probably to an even greater degree. So, once I get a little distance from an issue, I begin to sort of reassess how successful I was as a writer at communicating certain things, or um, sort of developing a tone or an atmosphere, and also thinking about the issue as a leg on this larger trip, right, for the entire story. Like, how well am I moving to this end point? And I think, you know, a lot of it is just trying to be conscious and reflect, and then also beginning to recognize the places where I feel like I've had weaknesses, and trying to study the creators who are are more successful in those areas, and have skill sets in those areas where I feel like I might not be the most suitable, and pull what I can, so that when it comes time for me to broach a similar situation or a similar challenge when it comes to the writing process, you know, hopefully at that point I'm a little bit more equipped to succeed in a way that I might not have been able to before.
Okay, so that'll bring us into our next question, referring to what other people might do or something in that nature. What have been your biggest influences, or who do you look to when you find yourself at a standstill with your writing, maybe writer's block or something of that nature? Where do you go for maybe some inspiration?
I think it's, I mean, I just try to, I don't know if it's anything specific. Really, I just try to find something, whether it's a comic or a film, or I'll watch like clips of television shows that I love, that I think are just like extraordinary. And sometimes, just by virtue of experiencing that, and diving into it, and surrounding myself with people that I think are brilliant, like creative minds, and it kind of begins to get the cobwebs shaken off a little bit. But when it comes to folks in the industry who, um, you know, I use as an inspiration right now, guys like Ram V. You know, I think he's one of the best guys, one of the best writers in the industry right now. Whether it's his stuff at the big two or his indie work, he's the guy's unbelievably smart.
Yeah, he's
Um,
writing Detective Comics and Carnage are my two favorite lines that he's doing right now.
Yeah, man, and his indie stuff is just out of this world. Like, if anybody wants to go back and read his stuff through Vault, it's called These Savage Shores, or Blue and Green from Image. Just brilliant stuff. And I think he has this really interesting approach that's both literary but also takes full advantage of what comics has to offer. I think in many ways that guy is probably the writer that I've always wanted to be, but now I'm like, oh shit, well, I can't just be Ram V, you know, 2.0 or less good Ram V. I gotta find my own niche. So his work is really great, because he balances really well the inclination for a writer to be kind of poetic and slightly flowery in their language, while also not letting that consume the fact that, you know, they're telling a story within a comic. And so, you know, sometimes you have those writers that just get way too wordy, or they get too poetic to such a degree that it doesn't sound like the characters that they've been writing. You know, but he's got that in the bag. So that's someone I look to. Guys like Jeff Lemire, who sometimes lean on the opposite end of that, where Jeff can be very poetic, but he's very, very sparing with his words and with text. And he lets a lot of the visual storytelling do a great deal of the work. And I think that is something that I very much try to live by, you know, as much as I'm clearly very verbal and I like to talk a lot. I try not to overwrite the page. My thing is that a majority of the storytelling should be in the visual direction. And anything that I might have to put on the page when it comes to text has to accentuate that to the best of my ability. So those are two guys that really, really inspire me. Two guys whose work I'm kind of constantly referencing, particularly when I get into those ruts where I'm like, ooh, I suck. I need like to remind myself what great comics read like. And those two very much kind of remind me of that.
Yeah, I know you've been behind on him, but if you haven't gotten caught up on what he's doing with Detective Comics, you definitely check it out, because it's very poetic, but also kind of, he's got a very dark and gritty way of writing. I don't want to say it's Edgar Allan Poe, but it has that essence around it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely like very operatic.
Yeah.
I read like the first two issues and I've been meaning to catch up for a while, which is something I very well might do over like the course of the next week,
Yes.
as a way to decompress from like Kickstarter and promoting and all that.
Yeah, it's definitely one we're checking out. All right, so I believe you gotten a new artist in the last issue, correct?
Hmm.
Yes. Okay. So how do you feel with the new artist doing issue 5, and how do you feel he did with issue number 6?
Oh, I absolutely adore Sam.
What do you think? What do you think has improved in telling your story by using this new artist?
Oh man, so much. Sam is just an incredible talent, both in his ability to kind of indulge me in like my weird little like uh ways that I try to stretch what we do, like so for anyone that's read issue 5, there's this sequence. The last 5 pages are 2 double page spreads and then one full splash with like some inset panels. And those are things that I never really would have pushed the boundary for. But once we got a couple pages in with Sam, I'm like, oh, I need to re-edit this, because what he's able to do, both on the design side, the way he is able to form the page and construct like the flow of your eyes throughout the page, and also like with the emotionality of the characters and their gestures and their expressions, is like he's able, I think, to really forge like this bond between the reader and the character just by sort of appealing on this very like human visual communication side. And he, man, like he is just like an absolute superstar in the way that he's able to make these characters feel real. Not that he's like a hyper realistic artist, but because they act and they express themselves as real people do. And I think that he is able to sort of catch them at the peak of every emotion, which is what we're always shooting for. Very, I don't give Sam crazy notes because he's so good. But the one thing we're always talking about is an emotion, a feeling is like, I can't figure out what direction things are moving in with the camera. But it's like a mountain, right?
Mhm.
And you only have so much time in a comic book to explore anything within a scene. And so you have to catch every feeling, every emotion at the top of the mountain. And that's exactly what he does. He catches it at like the peak of its intensity. So aside from that, and just like his ability to process visual storytelling and translate, sort of my thoughts and my script is just incredible. Like the beautiful thing about Sam, and the reason I brought him on, was because it's not that he necessarily gets everything right the first time, and he does often. It's that the osmotic process of sort of discussing our approach and why we want to do certain things and how we want to do certain things in the creative process, I think ends up making something that's so much greater than anything I could have pictured in my head, or anything that anybody else could have created if they had just tried to like word for word recreate what I have on the script on the page. So it's like you have my vision that's filtered through Sam's lens, and it creates something that's way better than anything I could have done, I think, really with anybody else. So he's just like an intuitive visual storyteller. And that is something I am incredibly fortunate to have come across so early on in my career. I think he is an artist that, like most people, probably don't really get to collaborate with until they are like coming toward like the height of their career. And I'm just so grateful that he and I are working together so early on, and we have more coming in the future. The guy's just like insanely talented. I mean, I could make this entire interview just me talking about how damn good he is. So if that, I hope I answered your question.
Yes.
He's added so much to the
I'm
book.
glad to hear that, because and that's actually, obviously I have lots of tattoos, and I like to take a rough sketch of an idea when I go to my artist, and I'll say, take this idea and make it your own. Make
Mhm.
it something that's you're going to truly appreciate and something that you really want to see come to life. And usually it far supersedes anything that I have in my mind that I could have possibly thought of myself, you know. And when it comes to your artist, Sam has done such an amazing job. Like, between the writing and the illustration and the artwork, he was able to really take the villain in issue number 5 and give him that origin story where it makes you feel for him. Like, it makes you think about like the Batman's One Bad Day almost. Like, it just takes one day, one thing to alter the course of somebody's life in such a drastic manner. And it showed that, it highlighted it in such a good way, in such a good manner, that it was just like, you know, at first, when you're first introduced to the villain, he's not a nice person. He's not a good person. There's no real depth to him whatsoever. And then in this issue, like, you get flooded with the depth of who he is and what made him the person that he is today.
Yeah.
And I think it was illustrated just beautifully in this.
Yeah, man. I mean, I appreciate that you noticed that, and Sam brings that out every step of the way. You know, as much as I love like stories that are huge and like incur a massive amount of world building, to me, at the end of the day, stories are about character and about struggle. And the way that Sam is able to portray that and bring the reader along, whether it's just like the expression of a character or the way that we're playing with sort of the perspective of which we're viewing that character visually speaking, I think it makes those emotional moments very raw and very visceral and very easy to connect with. And that is huge, particularly in a medium like comics where you have such limited space and you're dealing with, you know, sequential images as opposed to, you know, a moving image like film. You know, it's very special to find an artist like that. And I can't wait for people to read the finale, because I think it's just the rawest, most like emotionally conflicting thing we've done so far. And even moving further, the stuff that Sam and I have planned is out of this world, man. I think you're muted, bro.
I don't know why it muted me. What do you think your comic offers that others don't?
Man, well, I think for one, it is always kind of conscious of being like in that genre bag and trying to do things within the genre that you can't do elsewhere. But also, it's not afraid to be super personal. You know, this story for me, the first thing I ever wrote was me trying to work through like a crisis of identity. So this story very much, I think, is relatable. And a lot of stories are relatable, but I think it executes on this very honest level. You know, like it's a story about a young man who's coming into a world that tries to tell him who to be and how to be it. And that tries to deny him agency based on who he actually is on the inside, and on the outside in many ways. But, you know, I think a lot of us can relate to that. And I think that there's a rawness to this story that we've been able to employ that makes this entire journey really hit close to home for a lot of different people, because it's a theme that might have a very specific aim, but appeals to a lot of different people. And I think, you know, another thing that makes this so special is just like the amount of care and reflection we've taken every step of the way to getting better and to pushing the boundaries of what we think we're capable of doing. I went into this story in the beginning feeling very confident about where I was as a writer and where my team was collaboratively. And we've grown and grown and grown. And by the time you get to the 5th and 6th issue, you know, I feel comfortable in saying that we can compete with anybody on the market, just in terms of being able to deliver a story that is of high craft, right? That is professional, not just, you know, in as a physical product, but we're delivering an experience that people can relate to and connect with and potentially be entertained by. So yeah, I think it's just yeah, Yeah, that's a very long-winded answer, but
No,
yes.
I definitely think it can be on the playing field right now. There's a lot of not great stuff out there right now, especially between the big two. Mainly DC. DC just hasn't been putting out the amount of quality. You know, they're putting out quantity like nothing else, but the quality of the writing, it really has been suffering lately. And it would be nice to see some fresh faces like yours in the writing rooms, you know, getting behind the books and creating some new and unique stories that we might all be able to fall in love with, like this one right here, like Area 51.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that. The goal for me creatively is always to do something that is emphatically mine. You
Yeah.
know, that doesn't, you know, I certainly have influences and I wear those influences very proudly on my sleeve. But I also never want to create something that feels like a less good version of what somebody else has done, simply because I admire it and want to replicate it. The story has to be mine, and it has to, and also it has to bear the sort of signature of the artistic team. And I think that between me wanting to do something unique and individual, and me, you know, having the fortune of working with such talented people that have their own sort of signature or imprint that they leave on their work, and their intentions, I think, to do the same, I think we create something very special. And I think that's, you know, in a world where the entertainment market is just filled with an overwhelming amount of content, I think that that's something that's really special, is trying to create something that really cuts through, for a lack of better terms, cuts through the fat, you know?
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, speaking on that, where do you see yourself in the next 10 years? You know, talking about these peers, the people you look up to, do you see yourself working side by side with individuals like this in the next 10 years? Do you want to be working with the big two? Like what's your goal in writing comics? Or do you just
Man,
want to write stories?
I mean, it'd be a dream. It would be a real dream, to be able to work alongside and learn from the people that I admire, that I think are, you know, changing the industry or changing our understanding of what the medium is able to do. You know, I think 10 years from now, um, you know, I mean, everybody as a fan would love to write some of these iconic characters from a larger company, you know, a Batman, a Superman, a Daredevil, a Thor, of course. Like I would love to do that. But I think what's central to my identity creatively, and as a storyteller, is also always being able to tell something that is 100% mine and 100% uninfluenced by like larger corporate interests, you know, because as much as you and I, and probably most of the people that are listening or watching this, love those iconic characters, you know, their directions are sometimes impacted by a story's ability to sell toys or whatever else, and you know, it is what it is. But I hope that 10 years from now, you know, I will have had the opportunity to play sort of in that sandbox of American gods, and work on these iconic characters, but also hopefully taking and making new strides on independent work, stuff that I own and that my collaborators own, that's really able to push the boundaries and push what we think we're capable of or even comfortable of trying doing. You know, I think comfort is death, creatively speaking. And so I hope that 10 years from now, that I've continued to elevate my game and see no end in sight. And also hopefully, you know, I'm working with some familiar faces, guys like Sam, and maybe some new folks, that push me in different ways as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I know one of the things that you really just stress out about during this time is not making that quota. And I know that this Kickstarter, you want to go bigger than you've gone before in any of the other ones. Your goal, your stretch goal, I think you said like is close to like 10,000, right?
Yeah, so yeah, although our funding goal is the same, personally, my personal goal is 10K. I
Yeah,
really,
because you want to be able to really give everything you can into this one.
yeah.
With so with that being said, what are your thoughts on failure?
Oof.
Mhm.
It's very complicated. And admittedly, um, I'm probably a little hypocritical when it comes to failure. I think that if somebody were to, um, be in a difficult situation and have failed at something, I would probably console them and say it's not really a failure if you're learning from it. But at the same time, I don't know, maybe the position I'm in and feeling like I'm a little bit behind the eight ball just by virtue of not getting into creating until, you know, like having studied something entirely different for 3 to 4 years at a university. Like, it's weird because there's a part of me that's like, yes, like I'm 25. I understand I'm young. And I understand that if I were to express publicly that I feel like I'm behind the eight ball, there are probably a lot of people that are just like, kid, shut up. But that is sort of an inherent pressure that I am probably self-inflicting. And so I'm constantly like, failure is not an option. I need to keep growing. I need to keep maturing, both as somebody who's trying to bring something out into the world and garner exposure for it, but also as a creative person who's just wants to become great, right? Like, and so I think failure is a pretty subjective term, and I'm giving a little bit of a non-answer, but I think that I for me there's a threshold, right? Like, if this Kickstarter does somewhere in the neighborhood of what the last couple have, in that like 8,500, 9,000 range, would I be content? No. Would I see it as an overall failure? No. But I would see a very large margin of improvement. And the failure to reach my goal, I think, is something that I would have to reflect upon, right, deeply, and try to figure out where I could succeed. So, you know, it's like I said, it is relative, because there is probably somebody watching this who's thinking about putting crowdfunding comics, or has crowdfunded comics, and they're like, oh man, you think $9,000 is a failure? You sound like an asshole. And maybe I do, but you know, I keep myself to a pretty high standard, and I think that by doing that, and by allowing myself the opportunity to struggle for something that might be a little bit above my weight class, forces me to constantly get better, and forces me to try new things in the pursuit of getting better and advancing. So I think ultimately failure can be a good thing, and can be probably the greatest teacher that the world has to offer, but it depends on what you do with it, and why the failure occurs, right? Yeah.
So, with that being said, do you think that you've had any failures so far as a comic book writer? And if you have, what have you done to overcome it?
Good question. Not that it was a failure, but I mean, as a writer, there were certainly times earlier on that I think that I belabored points a little bit, and I could have just kind of gotten to it. And you know, in retrospect is 2020. So I think I needed to make those mistakes in order to grow, right? Like, in order for me to recognize what I need to do in the future, or what I should not do in the future. So a lot of it, yeah, is looking back when it comes to the writing side, is looking back at those earlier sort of steps. And I think about, you know, now with everything that I know at the moment, how would I write that issue now? How would I have opened up this story to make it a little bit punchier? And I'm definitely I'm doing my best to take those lessons and employ them in the future. You know, like the first 2 issues to my next series, my next full series, I think are the best 2 things I've ever written. And it was because I made mistakes in those first 2 issues of the Helix Project. And you know, fairly, I think a lot of readers don't recognize them, but you know me, and you know how picky and sort of critical I am. So I'm always sort of pulling those things apart, and I look at them and I'm like, okay, like, we set up a pretty decent sort of emotional quandary for this character that ultimately I think pulls people in. But there are times where I'm like, okay, I think I might have wasted maybe half a page here or a full page here, and I could have done something that drives to the core of that a little bit more, so that when we eventually get to these later issues, that payoff is greater. although I think all things considered, I think that it was a pretty well developed story that ultimately could have been fine tuned earlier on. So yeah, I think just what's important as a writer is constant self reflection and looking at work from people who you think succeed in areas that you might not feel that you're as great at. And if you ever, I think creatively, if you ever get done with something and you're like, oh, there's nothing I would change, I think you're doing it wrong.
Yeah. There should be always just one, even if it's the smallest, littlest thing, even changing font, maybe the size of something, just relatively small, a centimeter difference. You never know. And that's the same thing I do with the YouTube channel. You know, I'm always trying to change it up, make it an improvement. If it doesn't work out, I'll go back to the way it was before. But you know, it's always those small things that eventually build up, and then by the end of it, you have something that you're truly proud to say that you created.
For sure.
By going back and making these rewrites or whatever the case may be.
For sure. And to be honest with you, I think honestly, my earlier failings on the Helix Project were less as a writer and more as an editor. There were definitely times where I think, you know, because I was so new, I was always trying to put myself in a position to learn from everybody that was involved. And I tried not to be like such a hard ass about certain things. And I think in some areas that benefited the book. But there were some areas where I think, you know, I was a little bit too lackadaisical. And for example, like we would be running behind on art because I was trying to give people leeway and be understanding. And then, you know, we ended up having to keep things in the book that I look back on and don't care for or think didn't quite accomplish what I would hope they would have or what I might have pictured they would have done. You know, simply because I don't want to say like it was because I wasn't being strict, but I guess I wasn't drawing enough of a line, and I let some of those things early on put me into a position where we were just running behind, and I had to put the book into print so that I could get the product to the people that back the Kickstarters on time. So, you know, even now, like one of the stretch goals, like once we eventually get to hopefully doing the trade for the Helix Project, one of the things I want to do is actually go back and remaster some of the artwork from the earlier issues, not like entire issue remasters, but just like parts and bits that I had to let go due to time constraints that I think like could really be tightened up and could really contribute in a much greater way to not only those issues, but to the overall picture of the story.
That'd be cool to see. I would like to see what changes that you would do now to the older issues and see how much it could affect that issue and the overall story. That would be interesting to see. So when we're talking about your story, we've seen Kent go through a lot of different things from being a kind of quiet, shy kid to being thrown into this hostile situation where it is just constant one thing right after another, and he's not even getting a second to breathe. That has led us to this ultimate climax. So in your opinion, and then we saw the Colonel as well do his growth. So in your opinion, what makes a good protagonist? And the other question, what makes a good antagonist?
Man, I think it's tough because there are so many different like formulas and structures for a protagonist. I think ultimately, creatively speaking, a protagonist has to be a character that has room to grow, and that they don't necessarily need to be likable, although that's helpful, but they have to be interesting and or relatable. And I think with Kent early on, I don't think he was particularly likable. I mean, he wasn't unlikable, but he was relatable, right? Like we've all kind of been at points in our life where we feel helpless, you know, and so as we kind of developed Kent and he started to recognize his lack of agency and begin to take a little bit more control of his life due to all of these crazy circumstances being thrown at him. I think he became a little bit more likable as that relatability factor that was already there continued to grow. So I think, you know, ultimately a protagonist has to be at least somewhat relatable, interesting, or likable, and it can be a combination of those three things. When it comes to an antagonist, I think an antagonist always has to challenge the core of what your protagonist represents, and for me, and it's a piece of writing advice that I've always kind of pulled from Scott Snyder, and the villain in many ways has to represent your character's greatest fears. And so, for Kent, the General Winters character always reflected another side of himself, this sort of monstrous version that he could have become based on the tragedy of his life, right? And I think I talked, when we sat down for that first interview, about how like the main cast of characters are all sort of slight mirrors on one another, and they're all sort of different perspectives on where Kent very well could have gone based on what's happened to him in his life. So, for me, a great villain, like I said, got to challenge the core of the character and represent some of their greatest fears, because it gives them something to overcome or something to face that will ultimately and hopefully make that character grow and become something new, something fresh. Like, as we get into this last issue, and you begin to realize that, the most evil thing that Colonel Winters could have done is sort of what he's turned Kent's father into, and so, like, for me, it challenges everything about Kent, because Kent has defined his life based on the loss of his father and what his father represented, and he's always been sort of confused about what that should represent, right? Like, although his father always taught him to connect and to relate and to try to understand things, that ultimately cost his father his life, and now as he re-encounters Roswell, who is kind of rightfully so victim to like this massive post-traumatic like psychological break, that and like now Kent has to kind of determine whether or not he needs to live in service of the memory to his father, and how best and what is the best way to do that, while acknowledging that like he is now a product of something that Colonel Winters created, due to that cruelty. So we're challenging the sort of image of the very thing that Kent has kind of, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. We're challenging sort of this image by which Kent has always lived his life by, right to the core, like right down to its spitting image. And so for me, that's kind of, I think, what makes the villain of that story particularly interesting. But I think it can change, as long as you keep those sort of core staples in the mix.
So, speaking on your characters, your female character, I always forget her name. It's Marissa or Melinda? Marissa,
No,
right?
you had it. Yeah.
Okay. I always get it mixed up. But yeah, so this is a character we really haven't talked much on in our interviews, but in this last issue, we've seen that, her herself had endured some kind of trauma. She was a relatively, she was a side character that wasn't utilized in a huge significant way. She was there to be more of a guide for Kent, to guide him where he needed to go to his ultimate end, or to the ultimate finale. But now we're seeing, her side story really start to blossom, and to see that her motives for helping Kent were so much more than simply trying to help him get back to and pay the father back for his kindness all those years ago. So go ahead and talk on her a little bit.
Yeah, so she, I think Marissa might have been like the most fun to write out of all the characters in the story. And when we talk about that sort of three-pointed structure of creating an interesting character, she was likable, I think, by virtue of just being like a badass, and also was kind of mysterious and just, like I said, I think early on, my biggest mistake as a writer is that I probably made her more interesting than Kent was. And yeah. And so she, I think in many ways though, just by virtue of existing and being a part of Kent's journey, I think he learned a lot from her, and a lot about like how to take control of a bad situation. But you know, I also I always knew that she had to come from a place of tragedy, and that was ultimately what motivated her to try to free Roswell. And aside from that, you know, the guilt of knowing that, you know, Roswell, spoilers for the beginning of a story, but you know, she had to kind of deal with the guilt of taking a father away from a son, as someone who knew what it was like not to have parents, right? Like not to have, or at least not to have good parents.
Yes.
And as she sort of, you know, recognized the implications of that on Kent, I think, you know, it begins to open up a little bit more of what makes her relatable as a character, and ultimately why I think what you learn about her in issue 5, I think it's what makes that a lot more heartbreaking, and what makes the end of the story a lot more heartbreaking, because throughout the story, you know, you kind of question this character's motives a lot, because she does some pretty awful things.
Yeah.
And you know, I think ultimately she was so fun to write, because I think she's a prime example that like people are not black and white. You know, you want to look at her very early on, and you think like she is just like this awful, like just like brutally mean and like cold person, but you begin to understand that like that sort of shell that she wore was a product of the harsh environment that she's had to trek through, and that at her core she is still very much human, and still very much driven by basic and relatable human desires. And so like you know, when it comes to like great stories, I always love a gray character that challenges like my perception of what is acceptable from a human being, or what is likable, because despite the fact that she does some pretty awful things, I think at the end of the story, like she's a very likable character, because we can relate to her. We can relate to like a lot of what she wants, even though we might not be able to relate to necessarily like what she's done, you know?
Yeah, definitely. She's an interesting character, and it's been fun to watch her really have that tough exterior, to be the badass out there, just knocking heads left and right. But at the end of the day, you learn that, you know, underneath that tough exterior is that little girl, little girl who's being screamed at by her mother. You know, the trauma that she endured from taking a father away from son, from because he would have been a good father, at least in her eyes. And taking that away, taking that opportunity for him to have that father, was, you could see how heavily it weighed on her once we got towards the end of issue 5.
Yeah, certainly like her journey is one of guilt. And I think that it speaks to a lot of people. I mean, it certainly, I mean, it spoke to me. Like a lot of the time people will ask me where these characters come from. And this cast, it's a very tight cast, but there's a piece of me in every single one of them.
Yeah.
You know, like, I mean, I mean, to, for lack of better words, or for lack of nuance, like Marissa is very representative of one, like my sort of sassy, spiteful nature, but also like, you know, I was raised as a Catholic, so therefore there is an immense amount of Catholic guilt.
Yeah.
And it's just like, you know, when it comes to her and her experience, the situation that she was in when she was young, that put Roswell into the situation to make the sacrifice that he did, like it wasn't her fault.
It wasn't at all.
But because she knows what the consequences were of that moment, she takes on all that guilt, and it shapes her, and it forms her, and it hardens her. And I think, you know, that's interesting. That exploration is interesting, particularly to see how it develops into who she becomes by the end of her place in the story.
Yes. All right. So for the last question, you mentioned it a little bit ago, but what's next?
Oh, I'm excited, man. I'm super stoked. So, you know, as people can surmise, this 6th Kickstarter is out into the wild right now. After that, I will be publishing an anthology, a collection of short stories. All of them are written by me, but every story has a new artistic team. You'll see some familiar faces, some brand new faces, and it's really an opportunity for me creatively to work in a couple different sandboxes and to flex those creative muscles. As much as I've really enjoyed developing and learning and writing this first story, I just kind of want to make a statement that I can't be pigeonholed, right? And that I have the ability to play in a couple different sandboxes. Two, it gives me the opportunity to work with a lot of cool different talent and learn something from them. And three, I think, after writing a 6-issue story that requires people to, if they were to sort of get in on it a couple issues in, it always requires them to go back and pick up something else. This gives me the opportunity to tell stories that are digestible, that anybody can pick up and have a sort of a beginning, middle, and end, and have it feel satisfying, and it all also kind of stems to this idea that I wanted. I had this idea of doing like maybe an annual anthology, and every one of the collected anthologies is related to a time on the clock, because my company is called Pocket Watch Press, and this first one for me was like, okay, at midnight when the day begins, what do I think of? And I think about perspective or a lack thereof, right? Like there's always that late night clarity when you are either sort of sinking in or overindulging yourself in certain thoughts, or you're finally able to somehow work around these things that have been ailing you for days, for weeks, for months, for years. And so I wanted to do this collected edition of stories where I get to play in all these different spaces that are loosely tied together through this theme of perspective. So we get to do a lot of really fun stuff. Like I wrote like a really hard sort of like detective thriller that has a little bit of a supernatural twist to it, which I'm super stoked for people to get to. That's actually a story that I'll be doing with Sam, who worked on these last 2 issues of the Helix Project, and the plan is actually for him to color them as well. So if you guys have seen Sam's covers to the Helix Project, which he did everything for, including the colors, I think you're going to be super psyched to see what he's going to be doing on this. I'm doing a story about these sort of immortal soldiers that reconvene throughout history, and they find each other at every major war throughout time to continue their own sort of self-contained quarrel. And it's ultimately like a story, this story about conflict and this perspective that I think that the world lacks on conflict. We just went through, I think particularly in the pandemic, it exacerbated things, but it's been like this for the last couple of years, wherein everybody feels like their opinion on something, on everything, on anything is life or death. And they feel like they need to attack each other. And when you look at conflict throughout history, ultimately, no matter how much we try to record it, like the impetus behind those things are lost, right? Like war is immortal, but like the real intention behind conflict is very temporary, and that's something I really wanted to explore in this story. We are doing. I have a futuristic sci-fi story. I have another interesting sort of drama piece that takes place entirely on like the rooftop of a skyscraper. Nice. Between like this billionaire and like a janitor that works for his company. That actually might be like one of the most emotionally raw stories I've ever written, just nice. Because it really focuses on this combustion chamber of these two characters. I have another supernatural story called the Marvelous Misadventures of the Melancholy Man, and it's a coming of age story about this empathic boy named Midas, who is born with the distinct ability to basically so it's a play on words from like King Lear, right? Like Midas is everything he touches turns to gold. Yeah. And so Midas is sort of this empath who is able to heal people's sort of emotional struggle at the cost of his own, right? Like it's this sort of transactional supernatural experience, or he can unburden his own sort of emotional and mental anguish upon other people to steal their happiness. And it's this coming of age story about this boy who learns to filter like life through that unique experience. And that story is actually one that I want to syndicate throughout every anthology for the foreseeable future.
Nice.
As we watch him come of age. So yeah, that's a super, like I said, kind of like emotional story. And for those of you that are like longtime comic book fans, there's actually a sort of major figure in comic book history that reappears in every story that I think you guys will really enjoy. And yeah, we've got a couple other sort of short stories that we're working out for that one, but it just gives me a lot of room to play creatively, to do different things, to say different things. And I think that it's just exciting to get to kind of have my hand in so many different cookie jars, and I think ultimately like these stories are super relatable, and in a way that I think the Helix Project establishes like that emotional and sort of resonance and rawness. I think a lot of these stories get to do the same, but ultimately they're a lot more digestible, and you have that sort of the closed brackets right there inside of that one book, generally speaking.
No, it's going to be very interesting to see what you do with that. I'm excited to see you jump into the different genres and touch get your feet wet in some of these other stories. And it's going to be also interesting to see you write a story that has a beginning, middle, and end that's not spanning over the course of 6 issues. So you're dealing with a more confined workspace. And so it's going to be interesting to see you have that story, have that beginning, middle, and end, have some kind of emotion or something derived from it, and close it and feel satisfied that story is what it is.
Yeah, man. It was definitely a really interesting challenge, creatively speaking, to be able to feel satisfied by such a small story, and to be able to connect with it emotionally with such little space. The nice thing about being my own boss is that inside of this story, like none of these stories have like a set page count or had a set page count when I went to write them. It was, moreover, I start the story, I end the story, how many pages felt right.
Gotcha.
Right? Like how long did I need to be able to do this? So there are some stories in there that are 6 pages. There's one story in there that's 14,
Nice.
So the nice thing is while there was a confine for sure, it gave me the freedom to be able to let the story breathe and walk around for as long as it needed to get to its point. So that was, in a way, pretty relieving, I think, despite knowing that I only had so much space.
You ever think about dabbling in the graphic novels?
Oh, I'd love to. I mean, if I wasn't so early on in my career and it was like financially justifiable to front a bunch of money for art, I would love to do that. I think, as I've taken to creating, I love reading floppies. I think there's something like very special about the act of reading a singular issue as it comes out. It's one of the few sort of American art forms, comics, and there's something special about that periodical nature. But like as a reader and as a storyteller, I like being able to sit down with a graphic novel and read an entire story arc at once. So maybe down the line, once I've kind of built my cloud up a little bit and I have the space to do it, I would love to just do like an OGN.
That'd be awesome.
I will say that there are, as I wrote more of those short stories, there were a couple of them, like 2 of them, that I was like, oh man, I might be able to like expand this slightly. Like maybe I'll take, for example, that detective story, which is titled Reflections and Other Little Devils. I keep thinking to myself, like, okay, this is an interesting 15 pages. I think we start and stop at a good point, but like there might be a little bit more juice. So maybe I can do like an oversized one shot and pull that out a little bit. And I think that's going to be really interesting, and being able to do things like that as like sort of baby steps to being able to do something along the lines of a graphic novel where you have an entire story in one complete package. So I'm super stoked. And then after the anthology, I have a larger work that right now is planned for 12 issues. And I'd like to pitch it to a larger indie publishers, but if not, we always have old reliable Kickstarter. And if we do it through Kickstarter, I'm contemplating doing like double-sized issues so that we don't have to wait so long in between. But that project will actually be teased inside sort of the ancillary pages of issue 6 of the Helix Project. But it's I don't normally like cross pitching, but to give people like a very vague inclination, it's like if you take the concept of the Illuminati meets Inception meets like the original Sin / Paradise Lost. That's kind of what we're going for. So it's very different, but at the core of it, again, it's just like a super emotionally raw story about control and about power.
Hell yeah. Well, all right. So let everybody know where to find you. Links. Give them all your socials.
For sure. Yeah. So, I'm sure links in the description, all that, but you can find me on Twitter at PWatchPress, which is one of the ones where I tend to be a little bit more active on. Facebook, Pocket Watch Press, you type that in, it should come up. But I think if you're like facebook.com/Pocket Watch Press 2020, Instagram is at Pocket Watch Press. If you've gotten so far and listened to me babble for forever, one, I'm super grateful, but you should really consider checking out this Kickstarter. We were talking about or Brian brought up the idea of doing graphic novels, and while this isn't quite a graphic novel, you can get the entire story in one big dose. And I consider it, particularly in the landscape of Kickstarter comics, incredibly affordable. I've always tried to make it accessible. So, you can get all 6 books on the Kickstarter.
Quality. Talk about quality of the book.
Thank you, man. Yeah. The print quality is super great, but if you find yourself a little strapped for cash and just want to like get the reading experience, you can get basically 7 comics digitally for like $22 or something like that.
That's super
and
good.
Like the page counts have only grown, right? Like we started with 24, we went to 28, and then 32. So you're getting ascending returns on that, which is great. But there are a lot of cool opportunities as well on the Kickstarter to get involved. There's one spot to be able to get drawn in, and yeah, cool shirts like that one. And I think the designs on the t-shirts I think have only gotten better.
I like the sleeves. They're real nice and tight.
Yeah, dude. Yeah. So as he's alluding to, there's always like an exclusive Kickstarter t-shirt that we never re-release. The one for this campaign is fucking sick. Actually, I can show you kind of roughly what the mock-up looks like because I made myself a phone case with it on there.
Oh, nice.
This is effectively what the Kickstarter tee will look like. It features Sam's artwork from the issue 6 cover. So I think it's a super sick design. It's probably my favorite t-shirt I've ever made.
It looks dope.
Dude,
I'll definitely be getting it.
Thanks, man. Yeah. So aside from that, if you're a hardcore supporter, like shout out Jay Corbin, who is I know is a viewer of yours who found me through your reviews. Man, where was I going with that? I'm slipping. I forgot my train of thought. If you're like a super hardcore supporter like Jay, you can be immortalized in the book as a producer, which he was kind enough to do in the last one. You actually get credited.
Hey, that's awesome.
Yeah, man. You get credited on the inside of the book as a producer or executive producer. And with those things come a bunch of crazy perks, like an exclusive producer sweater that we never re-release, the credit. You have the option for like a one-on-one like video call with me and the creative team to talk about whatever you want to talk about, and a slew of goodies like hard metal art prints, the books, obviously, cool enamel pins, like a bunch of stuff. So yeah, I think there's a lot of unique experiences in there, including for those aspiring creators. I actually offer like a portfolio review for both writers and artists. It's 100% private, and you get my like complete focused attention. And if Brian can speak to this, I've always been like a very sort of surgically minded creative type, so I will do my best to kind of help dig into where I think you might be able to grow and yeah, where you might be able to grow in your craft and hopefully push you in the right direction of doing that. If you think that, you know, it's going to be of value to you. So a lot of cool opportunities.
Make sure you're good at constructive criticism, because you're going to get a lot of it.
There, yes, but you know that it's honest. So that is a virtue, I think.
It's 100% what people need. But yeah, thanks, Trevor. Thank you so much for being on the channel. Thanks for being my first live stream ever.
I think you muted yourself again, bro.
I have my notepad on my keyboard, so every time I touch it, it hits a button. I'm gonna move that. But yeah, thanks for being on the channel. Thanks for being the first live stream. I'm hoping that this one will get a lot more views with it being a live stream, so we can definitely get you out there and get this one funded for you.
Oh, dude, I appreciate it, man. And truthfully, like I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here and to reach your audience, but also like just person to person, dude. I am so grateful for the support that you've shown the book, whether it's going in and being an active sort of supporter in the pre-orders, or like just talking about it and sharing it with people. It means a lot. Like no hyperbole. I said it earlier. Without you and people like you, I don't exist. I don't get to do this. And being able to tell this story and continue to tell stories in comics has been an absolute privilege, like the greatest privilege of my young life. But it's so fulfilling, and I'm so incredibly grateful to be in this position. So thank you, man. I
keep on putting, like I always tell you, man, keep on putting out the quality, and I'll keep buying it. Because that's what I want. I want good quality, and you're definitely, like I've said before, you're 25 years old. Like you are literally paving the way for the younger generation of comic book creators. And I guarantee we're going to see you up there. We're going to see you up there with Ramvi. We're going to see you in the big two. You're going to get all that stuff. I promise you.
Thank you, man. And quick shout out, like, to anybody from the audience that's watching this that has backed the book in any way, shape, or form, whether it's in a previous campaign or you're thinking about doing it now. Thank you. Thank you so much for letting me get to play in these sandboxes and for giving me the opportunity to bring you these stories and to connect with you and grow as a storyteller. It's incredible. And hopefully if you're watching this at some time in the near future, I'll get to meet some of you at conventions and sign your books and say hello and shake your hand in person. So it was a pleasure being here, man. Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. Make sure you guys like and subscribe to the channel, and